Thanks everybody for coming. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being part of this second conversation. And thanks Margaret for the introduction and Elizabeth for everything, because she really is the one who makes everything possible, as well as
look at those amazing colleagues out there.
In addition to a squad of people out there. So as everybody knows, this is the second conversation we're doing on Israel and Palestine. What I'm going to try to do today is bring some of the insights from that first conversation to bear on this one today. I'm going to repeat some of the questions that Nora asked Professor Lustig, because I think the answers are going to be different. I think there's going to be productive disagreements. And by doing that, I'm hoping we're going to model how to have productive disagreements, particularly between scholars who have devoted their lives to studying this subject and reach different conclusions about the vocabulary, the context, the explanatory variables. And I also want to start by saying, I think today's conversation is going to be a little bit harder than last one's was, for reasons that we'll probably get into, but it's a very different viewpoint than Ian's, and that's kind of the point. We're enacting 4 of these conversations, not a single one, and so in doing so, we're bringing lots of different perspectives to the table in order to try to learn from different perspectives. And that's part of the reason I'm going to continue with asking some of the same questions multiple times. So just why are we focusing on Hamas? One of the insights that I think we got from last week from Ian was that ignorance pervades a lot of our debates, a lot of our conversations about Israel and Palestine, and we can't craft effective policies based on ignorance. And that includes ignorance about Hamas. So what we're hoping to do today is aim for a little bit more understanding of Hamas. What do I mean when I say that we want to understand Hamas? My goal is not to ask you to support Hamas or to agree with the atrocities that Hamas committed on October 7th. What I'm asking you to do is not make the same mistakes that this country made after September 11th. Right? And by that, I mean, which was to depict Al-Qaeda as outside of history, as a set of actors who didn't have agency, who were not part of the population, we weren't using proper nouns. Because the result, and Biden really described Hamas in similar terms to the way he did Al-Qaeda, he described Hamas as evil, right? Which, as Ian said, normatively, you can agree with that, but in terms of policy, it's an unproductive starting point, because the response to evil was 20 years of military occupation that failed, right? 2 wars in Afghanistan and Iraq that didn't achieve their objectives, right? It didn't work, right? And regardless of what metric you use to assess that failure, if it's number of Americans killed, more than twice the number of Americans were killed in those wars than were killed on September 11th, right? Or whether your metric is the millions of people, 40 million people displaced as a result of those wars, right? That was a failure. Or in terms of the economic devastation, the numbers are really difficult. $2.3 trillion resulting from those failed responses to 9/11, the occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan. Millions of people displaced, hundreds of thousands of people killed, far and beyond just the Americans that were killed. And that overreach, that imperial overreach, right, had devastating effects, not just in the Middle East and Central Asia, but also very much at home. So scholars say you cannot disentangle, right, Donald Trump's attempt to overthrow the results of the 2020 election from the economic inequality and the increase in racial and religious prejudice that accompanied the post 9/11 wars, right? Those are twinned. That irrational and failed response to evil is what we're trying to get beyond today. So history is our guide, ignorance is our enemy, right? And understanding is our goal. And there's no better person to lead us in that conversation than Tareq, whose book on Hamas, and I'll do the John Stewart moment one more time, right, is widely seen as the definitive guide to the subject, although it's only 5 years old, and I think there's still much to be learned and much to be debated. So let me start with Tareq. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
So first of all, thank you. As Margaret said, I know your schedule is stretched thin from being all over podcasts and the media. I'll start with a very basic question, which is why should we understand Hamas? Assume that our audience doesn't know anything more than Hamas, that anything beyond that October 7th, Hamas broke out, or part of the military broke through the barrier between Israel and Gaza, over a dozen locations, killed estimated 1,200 people, took around 240 hostages. Understanding that violence is, of course, important, but more broadly, right? In addition to that, why should we understand Hamas?
Well, thank you for that opening question, Jeremy, and thank you for having me and for giving me this opportunity to talk to your students. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. So, I mean, I think fundamentally the reason that we need to understand Hamas is that it's part and parcel, it's a very important constituent of the Palestinian Liberation Project. So if we want to think about achieving any kind of just peace in Palestine, Israel, there's no way to do that without understanding Hamas, because it's a key player in that territory. And from the perspective of the Palestinian Liberation Project itself, it's been one of the most active actors since at least the end of the 90s, so before the beginning of the Second Intifada. And so Hamas really must be understood as a nationalist movement, as a political movement that is active throughout the Palestinian territories, not only through its military infrastructure, which I'm sure we'll talk about, but also through a very extensive social infrastructure. So a welfare infrastructure, charitable organizations, educational facilities, religious facilities, even healthcare clinics, and it has a political project, a political platform. So for those of you who don't know, Hamas was the party that emerged victorious from the democratic elections that happened in 2006. So no elections have happened in the Palestinian territory since then. So it is actually the last party to be democratically elected by the Palestinians living under occupation. So that includes the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and residents of East Jerusalem. And so in that way, if we are to understand Palestine, Israel, the dynamics unfolding now before October 7th and since October 7th, and if we are to think about what policy recommendations we can put forward for achieving a just peace, ignoring Hamas or suggesting that Hamas is outside of this context or somehow irrelevant to the context of understanding Palestine, Israel is a fundamental misreading of both Palestinians and Hamas.
Okay, wonderful. So let me follow up on that because you spend a lot of time in your book digging into the social welfare provision, and other scholars of Islamist movement, particularly the Muslim Brotherhood, which Hamas is connected to, was originally a branch of, still connected to. That's really fundamental for understanding how other Islamist movements operate. And what I appreciate is that you're focusing on some of the different aspects of Hamas. So besides the military wing, right, what are the other activities? The social welfare provision, how big is it? Your book particularly focuses on Gaza, but of course there's also more influence in the West Bank as well. And then supplement to that question, how has that changed over time? So particularly the 2006 election in Gaza, and then also under this new 2017 leader, Yahya Sinwar, right? What has changed under his leadership? So give us a sense of the broader organizational activities, and then some sense of change over time since the election and under the new leadership that's gotten a lot of prominence in recent days.
Great. That's a big question. So I'll break it up into phases. So just to give some background, some context to what Hamas is, to explain its social infrastructure. So Hamas, as you say, is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. So this is an organization that was founded in Egypt in 1928, and throughout the 40s, we have Muslim Brotherhood chapters emerge within the Palestinian territory. So in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, and in the Gaza Strip. The Muslim Brotherhood at the time was focused on what it called Islamization. So the idea was that the only path to liberation is through the creation of a society, in this instance, a Palestinian society, that is grounded in Islamic virtue. So that that learns through the Quran and develops a code of ethics for everyday life that's based in Islam. Now, this approach allowed the Muslim Brotherhood to develop quite an extensive social infrastructure, as I said, in all different facets of life, from healthcare to education to religion to charitable outlets and so on. And because of its focus on social issues, the Israeli occupying forces at the time granted it a license to do the work that it did, because it didn't think of this movement as anything that was political or military, but rather something that was focused on social issues. Throughout the 90s, we see an increasing challenge against the Muslim Brotherhood for its focus on social issues when the occupation was so active and so violent against Palestinians. So there's pressure on the Muslim Brotherhood to begin confronting the occupation more actively. And in 1987, a decisive shift happens whereby the leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood decide to establish Hamas. Now, Hamas kind of flips this idea of focusing on Islamization before liberation and comes out and says, actually, the only way to develop a society that is virtuous and to develop an Islamic society is first to liberate Palestine from this foreign occupation and then to focus on socialization. So it kind of flips over the ideology that the Muslim Brotherhood had until then been committed to. But in so doing, rather than spinning off as an offshoot, which is what Islamic Jihad did about 6 years before it, it actually ends up subsuming the entirety of the Muslim Brotherhood infrastructure. So Hamas emerges as a military power, as a political power, but also one that has a vast social infrastructure. And so fast forward a decade and a half to 2006, we see the movement, and we can go through all the details of that transition, but we see the movement deciding to engage in the political elections that were scheduled to happen for the Palestinian Authority. And in putting forward a political campaign, the movement relies on its social infrastructure, because that infrastructure means that it has a significant connection to a grassroots population, that its fingers on the pulse, it understands what the people need, and it's able to hear the message on the street. And the message on the street by that stage, which is the end of the Second Intifada, is that Israel's not interested in peace. Palestinians had given the historic concession of recognizing the state of Israel in 1988 to end up with more settlers than ever before within the occupied territories. And actually, the only way to confront the occupation is to fall back on resistance. And by resistance, I don't mean only armed resistance, but also other forms of resistance, including political resistance and popular resistance. And Hamas emerges as the victor in those elections in 2006. And several things happen over the course of the next decade, but the fundamental thing to understand is that the Israeli authorities and the members of the international community led by the US, specifically this body called the Quartet, which is composed of the US, the EU, the UN, and Russia, decide actually that there's no way to accept the democratic election. And the US here takes the lead in initiating a regime change operation. So they begin funneling funds and arms into the Palestinian territories to try to overturn the results of the democratic election. And this facilitates a civil war between Hamas and Fatah, from which Hamas emerges victorious and takes over the Gaza Strip, and Fatah has been restricted to the West Bank. So to answer sort of the second and third portions of your questions, so the focus on Hamas in Gaza is partly the result of this, because in its more recent history, Hamas is in some ways contained in the Gaza Strip. What happens in the West Bank is that through security coordination between the Palestinian Authority and Israel, every effort is put in place to try to dismantle Hamas's infrastructure in the West Bank. So socially, but also militarily, Hamas is really weakened in the West Bank in terms of its organizational presence, and it ends up being specifically sort of restricted to the Gaza Strip. And that's where it enters into a particular kind of dynamic or equilibrium with Israel, which I'm sure we'll get into in a second. But it stays in this dynamic contained in the Gaza Strip since 2007 until October 7th of last month. Now, Yahya Sinwar emerges as a leader a few years ago, and in his rise as a leader of Hamas, a couple of things are happening. One is that we see the center of gravity of the movement shift into the Gaza Strip. So Hamas as a movement is not within the Palestinian territories, it's restricted to the Gaza Strip, but actually much of its political leadership is abroad. They're in Egypt, they're in Turkey, and they're in Qatar at the moment. And its last leader before Yahya Sinwar was Khalid Mash'al, who was located in Doha in Qatar. So with Sinwar's rise, we see the center of gravity of the leadership shift back into the Gaza Strip. And we see another development, which is that the organizational power of the movement shifts from the political leaders, so Khalid Mash'al, into the military leaders, which is Yahya Sinwar. So Yahya Sinwar comes from a military background. And this is someone who spent a lot of time in Israeli jails, took that time to understand Israeli society, and really begins to lead Hamas down a path that is, in some ways, a pretty big change from the decade and a half that it had been on before his rise.
Okay, let me follow up, and thank you for the comprehensive overview. I'll try to ask fewer double-barrel questions of what political science students know, like that's bad practice and survey research. Can do better. Bad practice in interviews as well. The prison angle, so the New York Times has made a lot of this, and Ian actually asked us to engage in an exercise where, if you're persuaded by an argument, ask yourself how it would feel if you switched the nouns, right? And it's so in this case, he suggested that to Hamas, taking of hostages from Israel might be seen as an equivalent to rescuing or trying to liberate hostages that were in Israeli prisons. And I had a hard time with that equivalence, to be perfectly honest, because the Israelis that are hostages were largely civilians, and my understanding that in Israeli prisons it was more Hamas, members, soldiers, right? More legitimate in terms of armed conflict. But then I realized that assumption really comes from France, right? So give us a better sense of who is in Israel's prisons. What does it mean that Yahya Sinwar, came up, spent 20 years in Israel's prisons, and his motivation, which seems to be part of the motivation for the October 7th attack, was to negotiate some sort of trade. And there's been talk in recent days that trade might even be happening within the next 72 hours.
Well, that's a really important question. I mean, I'll say 2 points to this. The first is that it's not entirely true that the Palestinians who are in Israeli jails are all militants. Actually, there are 7,000 Palestinians in Israeli jails. 200 of those are children. And about 2,000 of those are political prisoners. So it's very difficult to come across any family in the West Bank, and I'll focus primarily on the West Bank because Israel hasn't been able to be active in enforcing its occupation in the streets of Gaza. It controls Gaza from the outside. But in the West Bank, it's very difficult to meet any Palestinian family that doesn't have a member in Israeli jails. So we're not talking about militants. We're talking about any person who engages in political activity in the West Bank can be held in Israel. And the tactic that is used by Israeli authorities is this tactic called administrative detention. which essentially means that a prisoner can be held without due trial or charge indefinitely. And that process can extend to years. So someone can be held under administrative detention for 6 months without really being told why they're being held. And then after 6 months, before, instead of being released or going to trial, that charge is renewed for another 6 months. And there are thousands of Palestinians who have gone through a process of being in jail for years, some decades, without really knowing why they're being held and without necessarily taking part in any military activity. And this is a tactic that's used against children, as I said, and teenagers in order to try to disarm them from engaging in any kind of political activity before they become adults. And there's extensive accounts of torture and ill treatment in Israeli jails of Palestinians. So for Palestinians, and this is not for Hamas, I'm not talking about Hamas, for Palestinians generally, the carceral system that Israel operates is one that is focused on killing any kind of Palestinian political activity. And it's extensive. So it's fully entrenched in Palestinian social networks and social infrastructure. And so when Hamas comes out, and so the issue of prisoners is one of the central issues for the Palestinian Liberation Project, regardless of where Hamas stands on this issue. And it's not seen as something that's restricted to the military front. So when Hamas comes out and says, you know, these captives are civilians that we're using in an exchange with for the Palestinian prisoners, it's very much civilians for civilians. We're not talking about civilians for the military. For the military personnel who are held in Israeli jails. So that's sort of the first thing that I would say. The second point and it's a bit more it's a bit more difficult to make, is that we're not only looking at Israeli jails, we're also looking at the jails of the Palestinian Authority, which are also part of Israeli apartheid. So the Palestinian Authority itself is a significant enforcer of Israel's occupation. The security coordination mechanisms that were put in place by the Oslo Accords makes it a responsibility of the Palestinian Authority to undermine any form of organizing or mobilization that happens within the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and since 2007, just the West Bank, which means that many of the Palestinians who are imprisoned in Palestinian jails in the Palestinian Authority are there as a result of Israeli directives. So Israel can maintain a degree of separation and say, you know, these are Palestinians who are in Palestinian jails, we have nothing to do with that. But the truth of the matter is that there are Palestinians who are imprisoned by Palestinians, so by the Palestinian Authority, under Israeli directives. And this is part of the reason why most Palestinians now see the Palestinian Authority not only as illegitimate, but actually as a constitutive element of Israel's apartheid.
Yeah, so there was a useful piece in Foreign Affairs by Amani Jamal on survey data among Palestinians, particularly in Gaza, and support for Hamas, for Fatah, the Palestinian Authority. The point that she really emphasized in the Foreign Affairs piece was how unpopular Hamas is, particularly in Gaza, and Fatah seemed to be somewhat more popular. But let me ask the broader question, right? How is Hamas perceived in the street? Right? How popular or unpopular is Hamas? How has that maybe changed over time, in particular in reaction to October 7th, but, you know, broader lens as well?
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that piece. I thought that the piece was deeply flawed, actually, and we can talk about. I will talk about that in the context of answering your questions. So Hamas's popularity actually ranges, and historically it's changed. So obviously, as I said, it was the movement that was democratically elected in 2006, and that's the last time we really have any kind of decisive insight into if Hamas and Fatah were to run in elections, who would emerge victorious. Historically, both parties pretty much come out on an equal footing, ranging between sort of the late 20s or early 30s in terms of the percentage points of their support. And for many Palestinians, it becomes an issue of identity. So some Palestinians who identify as Islamists, who are religiously conservative, might align themselves with Hamas because of their social networks, for professional opportunities, to get welfare opportunities, whatever the case might be, even if they don't necessarily buy into Hamas's political project or its resistance project. And the same with Fatah. So people who might identify as more nationalist or more secular might align themselves with Fatah. So it becomes an issue of identity. And I'd say by and large, the majority of Palestinians, and it's important to note that those are only Palestinians under occupation. So we're not polling Palestinians in the refugee camps abroad or in the diaspora, or Palestinian citizens of Israel. So only for Palestinians under occupation, I'd say there's split between these two camps, but I would also say at the same time that the majority of Palestinians actually have no faith in either Hamas or Fatah as viable political projects for their liberation. So that's the first thing I would say. The second is that historically, and this is specifically the case after Hamas's containment in the Gaza Strip, we see that there's increasing resentment against Hamas in Gaza for its role as a governing authority. So obviously, for all the reasons that any governing authority comes under criticism, the life of the Palestinians in Gaza is not fundamentally enhanced. There are more and more examples of corruption at the top of Hamas's leadership. And Hamas obviously is an authoritarian party. So in terms of political plurality, in terms of freedom of speech, all of those things, it's not necessarily popular as a governing authority, in much the same way that Fatah isn't popular as a governing authority in the West Bank. So the paradox here is that if you're sitting in the West Bank and you ask people about Hamas, there's resentment towards Hamas and more support towards Fatah. But if you go to the West Bank, there's more support for Hamas and less support for Fatah. So it's the situation where the governing parties sort of losing its street cred because people are understanding what governance looks like under those parties. But having said that, when Hamas engages in military activity, and I'm speaking historically, it's too early to be able to say anything about the current military assault, but historically, when Hamas engages in resistance, its popularity rises to above 90%. So the Palestinian street rallies around Hamas, and they see in the movement and in the movement's military resistance, the first line of defense against Israeli colonial violence. So Hamas then becomes a line of defense for the Palestinian people. So we see there's a lot of support, a lot of engagement with Hamas's resistance activities. And then when the retaliation ends and the scale of the destruction after Israeli assaults are sort of really surfacing, then resentment and disillusionment with Hamas kicks in. So it's kind of that life cycle that follows. Now, part of the reason I started the answer by saying I found that piece quite flawed is because it's sort of making the argument that Hamas doesn't represent the Palestinian people, therefore we cannot hold everyone in Gaza accountable to Hamas. Now, that's of course correct. Hamas does not represent the entirety of the Palestinian people. But the reason it's problematic is because that suggests that if someone does support Hamas, a nurse who's working in a clinic that's run by Hamas, or someone who affiliates themselves politically with Hamas, that they would then be a legitimate target, that support could suggest that they are legitimate. It's trying to separate Hamas from the Palestinian streets. There is support for Hamas on the Palestinian streets. It is part and parcel of the Palestinian Liberation Project. And reading these polls, in a way that tries to skew that, suggests that it's somehow external to that. And I think we need to be very careful with how we read those polls.
So let me follow up a little bit, because you've used this term multiple times, and I want to understand it a little bit more, the Palestinian Liberation Project, right? You're very much nesting Hamas as part of that project, but not representing the entirety of that project. So tell us a little bit more about what Hamas's current prominence, right, masks within the larger project. Because to be perfectly honest, if part of, so again, this point that Ian made is, if you're in any argument, try to switch sides and see how it feels, right? So if I was middle class, bald academic in Gaza, I would be supportive, right? And particularly, the moments of resistance, right? In political science, we talk about a rally around the flag effect that is real, but is also rather short-lived, right? It's not a very durable strategy for any particular political movement, so it might be supportive, but Hamas as a symbol for resistance masks a lot of other trends within Palestinian society. And so what does that prominence hide from view? What is the broader project that we should understand that Hamas is a part of, but not necessarily representative
Yeah, it's a great question. So historically, the Palestinian Liberation Project was embodied in the Palestine Liberation Organization, so the PLO, and that's a representative. It's an umbrella of Palestinian organizations with different political tendencies. So leftist organizations, secular organizations, nationalist organizations. There's a whole host of political organizations that constituted the PLO, which emerged obviously as a sole and legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. Now, the PLO was committed to using armed resistance to liberate the entirety of Palestine. That was the PLO. It was part of the anti-colonial wave of the 60s and 70s. And that was the Palestinian Liberation Project embodied in sort of third world anti-colonial movements, so decolonial revolutionary movements. And in 1988, the PLO made the historic concession of conceding on 78% of the land of historic Palestine. So recognizing the state of Israel, laying down its weapons and saying, actually, from now on, we will engage with the question of liberation diplomatically, so through negotiations. And that's failed, and we can talk about that failure. Hamas emerged at almost exactly the same time. So while the PLO was laying its weapons in 1988, Hamas emerges in 1987, and really its first charter in 1988. And it emerges as a movement committed to armed resistance for the full liberation of Palestine. But unlike the PLO, it does that in an Islamist cloak. So it emerges as, in some ways, an Islamist movement that's carrying the same demands of the Palestinian liberation movement. And so fast forward to today, when someone like me, who is an analyst looking at the movement, is thinking about the liberation movement, I see two things. One, I see continuity. So there are the political demands that have underpinned even pre-PLO politics, but then the PLO, then Hamas, which is the liberation of Palestine from foreign occupation. And that includes a whole host of things, including the right of return of refugees and other rights that are enshrined as inalienable rights for Palestinians under international law. So that's sort of the main infrastructure of the Palestinian Liberation Project. And then within that, you get the different types of what different constituencies and political formations and organizing exists. So Hamas, as we said, is one type, and that's the Islamist wing. And Hamas is not a part of the PLO. So you'd have the other type, which is the PLO, which is now the party that's subsumed into the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. And then you get a whole host of other forms of organizing. So you get civil society, popular organizing that's committed to putting forward an anti-apartheid struggle. So that looks to South Africa as a way forward. There's the BDS movement, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement, which also learns from South Africa as a way of initiating boycotts and divestments from the state of Israel. Then there's mobilization within the state of Israel, so Palestinian citizens of Israel who are demanding equality within the state. All of these formulations collectively are the Palestinian Liberation Project, and there's both a point of strength and a point of weakness. The point of strength is that, like any liberation project, this liberation project is diverse and immense, and there are agreements and disagreements internally. So many do not agree with Hamas's ideology or with its tactics. Others do, but there's a very vibrant and very dynamic space to engage with, what the Palestinians and the Palestinian people are calling for. So that's the strength. The weakness is because of historically the way that the PLO was marginalized, and because of its failure and the failure of the international community to really hold Israel to account and allow for a two-state solution. The overarching body that has legal and diplomatic rights in the international community no longer represents this diversity. There's no longer a container that holds the Palestinian political project that's able to say, these are the demands of the Palestinian people in a way that is actually accountable and representative of the grassroots. And in some ways, that's the biggest weakness of the Palestinians today, that an organization like Hamas can do what it does, and that then implicates the entirety of the Palestinians, because there's no national project, there's no political framework that's able to hold that development.
Yes. So if I can push a little bit on 2 points that you're making, Tareq. Really thoughtful, and I appreciate the broad overview, right? While also speaking to the current moment. You say rightfully, right, that the Palestinian Authority, the PLO, failed in terms of establishing a state. But can't we also say that Hamas has failed too, right? We're talking about 3 decades of armed resistance and very little to show for it. I mean, in the book, you talk about the sort of symbolic, emancipation within an open air prison. And I get that like the prison guards are in charge of their own prison, and maybe that's symbolically useful, but there's no meaningful success in terms of establishing a Palestinian state. So hasn't Hamas failed too?
Absolutely. I mean, in some ways, if you asked me this question before October 7th, I would have said that there's every indication to suggest, and this is where I end my book, with the idea that Hamas is pacified, that like the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, in the Gaza Strip, Hamas has been effectively contained. And the only way that it can get food or water in and out of the Gaza Strip or fuel is through engagement with the occupying forces. And so in some ways it itself is engaged in security coordination mechanisms with Israel. And in that way, it's also been pacified. And in some ways, Israel had succeeded in the divide and rule tactic of any colonial power and enabled that kind of containment and division. And yes, that at least it's a failure temporarily. And that's what I say in my book, that in some ways Hamas was contained and pacified, but obviously I'm a historian. I don't look into the future, so I don't really know where that would go. But the way I ended was to say that the reason why it's probably a temporary pacification, unlike the Palestinian Authority, is unlike Fatah, Hamas never offered a real ideological concession. So it remained committed to its core drivers. Now, post-October 7th, I think it's actually a bigger question whether it succeeded or failed. So on the one hand, the attack on October 7th has initiated what Palestinians are referring to as another Nakba, so the Nakba of this generation. And in some ways that can deal a lethal blow to Palestinians, especially if the scale of killing continues in the Gaza Strip, if Palestinians are expelled from Gaza. The ethnic cleansing that is happening now in the West Bank, not just in the Gaza Strip, can get to levels where as a society, the Palestinians will have another catastrophe, which will take generations to overcome. And in that way, Hamas might have failed in ways that it might have not anticipated before October 7th or its attack. On the other hand, Hamas dealt Israel a decisive blow. It's really undermined a fundamental tenet of Zionism, which is that there can be safety for Israeli Jews in Israel while the Palestinian question is unaddressed. And that's really disrupted the paradigm that Israel and the international community deals with Israel, that this can be a safe haven for Israelis while Palestinians remain under apartheid. That paradigm has been irreversibly disrupted. And so in some ways, it succeeded in dealing probably the strongest blow to Israel's occupation since 1948. So where that takes us is unclear, and obviously the stakes are very high. As I said, we're living in the throes of another Nakba, but it's also something that really broke apart a fundamental tenet that the Israelis had held onto, that their regime of apartheid is sustainable and cost-free.
Let me ask a second follow-up to that point, and I'm going to ask the same question that Nora asked for Ayan. So what came up with Ayan was the language of colonialism and anti-colonialism, anti-colonial resistance. And his view was, yes, that language is useful. The early Zionist settlers describe themselves as settlers. A recent interview in the New Yorker continues to use the language of settlers. So very much continuity in terms of settler colonialism. But he pushed back because he said, well, what do you do with that vantage point in terms of policy, right? So how useful is the language of colonialism? And then what do we do with that in terms of decolonizing? What policies come out from that particular vantage point?
I mean, I think the policies are very clear. And there are several that I can even suggest. I think the most important one is that if we accept that this is a form of settler colonialism, and we understand that legally and historically to be something that's actually quite unexceptional, that it's happened in other states and in other geographies, including in South Africa. Then we also have a body of international law that allows us to deal with that. And specifically, I'm thinking about apartheid. In the South African case, the settler colonialism, they described it as settler colonialism of a special kind, and that was described as apartheid. It was focused on a regime of racial domination that was specific to South Africa. Now, apartheid became a crime against humanity, and this is a crime that now is its consensus among the human rights ecosystem, Israeli, Palestinian, and international, that Israel is also an apartheid state. So as a matter of policy, the international legal system already highlights what can be done, what is the responsibility of members of the international community to deal with an apartheid state, how there can be measures of accountability that are put in place in order to try to dismantle the infrastructure that gives a certain kind of people rights and others not. So there's a whole body of policies that can emerge just from recognizing what it means that Israel is an apartheid state. So that's on the first suggestion. The second is that there's a lot, especially in the policymaking community, there's a lot of emphasis on the ultimate solution, quote unquote, that can take place on the ground, whether it's sort of a two-state solution, a one-state solution, what the political architecture can look like. And the truth is that the international community has been dealing with the idea of partition and the two states since before Israel was established. This was the Balfour Declaration in 1917. And the notion of partition has failed. We almost have a century of policy that's grounded in partition that's failed. And I think policymakers suffer from a degree of inertia that because this policy is already sort of in existence, it develops its own self-fulfilling prophecy. So it sort of determines its own raison d'etre. And so it's important also to break out of the constraints of policy and to start thinking in political imaginaries. What could it be like if it wasn't partition? What is the possible reality for the inhabitants of that land to coexist and to coexist without domination? And if we start thinking in those ways, actually a whole host of opportunities emerge, but they all have to be grounded in an initial understanding of what is the source of violence in this space, and that's structural. It's not individualistic.
Okay. So let me ask another follow-up question that's very similar to what we asked Ayan, which is the violence that's happening now, right? So one of the questions asked, in recognition, I think at that point it was 9,000 people killed. Now we're up to 11,000 people killed. By some estimates, it's up to 20,000 because we don't really know how many bodies are under the rubble and because hospitals are effectively not operational. And that was the main metric for assessing. So the question that we asked Ayan was, is this ethnic cleansing? Is this genocide? And his view was no. Even while there's some Israeli politicians have expressed support for genocide or ethnic cleansing, and even in answering no, that shouldn't detract from our horror at the scale of atrocities, right? But that is not an accurate description. What's your view?
I mean, I find that view deeply troubling, actually, because it's not, and I would have said that before October 7th. Because again, if we look at the structural violence, not the individual violence, if we look at the structure of what's happening, we have over the course of the past few decades, and certainly under Netanyahu's rule, a shift in the political establishment that's very decisively fascist. They're openly, and it's not my language, this is the language of Israeli politicians, openly talking about transfer, openly talking about expelling Palestinians, openly talking about the creation of, or the entrenchment of Israeli sovereignty from the river to the sea. And this is something that existed even years ago with the nation-state law that was pushed forward under Netanyahu, that Jews have more rights than Palestinians in that space. And the reality of the architecture of the state, and obviously I'm talking about the institutions of the state, is one that is committed to it being a Jewish state in a space that's now, if not, I mean, the last census in 2020 is that there's more Palestinians than Israeli Jews living in that space. But even if there isn't, that there are two communities that are almost on parity. And the sovereign in that space is committed to Jewish supremacy. Now, over the course of the past few months, before October 7th, we've seen this state increasingly arm settlers in the West Bank to terrorize and expel Palestinians from their homes. And they openly talk about this as a form of demographic engineering. They openly talk about this as extending Jewish sovereignty. They talk about it inside Israel itself in the Galilee, where they're talking about Judaization of the Galilee. And so the idea of getting rid of Palestinians in order to maintain Jewish sovereignty is as old as the state. It's actually before the state in the Zionist settlement project. And so the speed with which we see the state after October 7th move to try to get Palestinians out, and we see leaked plans from Israeli ministries about what the population transfer could look like if Palestinians were expelled from Gaza, And if you notice, I'm not talking about the number of Palestinians killed. I'm just talking about intent. The intent is everywhere around how to deal with the Palestinians. So you couple that intent with the now tens of thousands who are killed. It's very hard for me to sort of not see that as a continuation of Israeli ethnic cleansing. Now, again, it's not me. You can look at legal scholars, including people like Omer Bartov, in the New York Times, who talks about this being possibly a case of genocide and certainly a case of ethnic cleansing. And I think it's really important for us to use that language and those rights because they have legal implications.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll open up to questions. We're asking a lot of you, Tareq.
No, this is my pleasure.
I appreciate it. We're hearing a lot of support in Washington and in Jerusalem for destroying Hamas. Ayan said that it had lost any legitimacy and could no longer be a negotiating partner for Israel. That reminded me very much of similar language about the Taliban after 2001. And the Taliban are back in power now that the US has left Afghanistan. So is it possible to destroy Hamas?
No. I mean, it's not, because again, if we go back to the earlier questions I answered, Hamas isn't just a military power. It's a social infrastructure and it's a political power. So let's say, and you know, this is just for the sake of argument, let's say that that there is a way to destroy Hamas. What does that entail? That entails the killing of literally tens of thousands of Palestinians. So it's a genocidal pull. That's what decimating Hamas means, because it's, again, not understanding Hamas to be a very big part of the Palestinian social and economic and political infrastructure. But let's say that were possible, and in the current climate, killing tens of thousands of Palestinians is okay. What that leaves us with is a constituency of Palestinians who are still committed to many of the same political goals that Hamas espoused, but that are just not couched in an Islamist ideology, which is armed resistance for liberation. This is a right for Palestinians under international law. So if Hamas is decimated tomorrow, or if for some reason it ceases to exist by some miracle, there will be another military power that is committed to fighting for Palestinian liberation. It might not call itself Hamas, but the political driver will be the same. And so focusing on Hamas in this way is really a continuation of efforts to try to suggest that there are no Palestinian political demands, that actually Palestine and Palestinians can be dealt with militarily, that this is how we deal with this issue, and politically we actually can continue to ignore it. And this Israel did with the PLO before Hamas. They routed the PLO out of Lebanon in 1982, exactly using the same language, that this is an infrastructure of terrorists, they have to be removed. It resulted in the Sabra and Shatila massacre in 1982. And lo and behold, now the PLO is, the partner that everyone wants to come back into the Gaza Strip and rule the Gaza Strip. And so the issue isn't actually Hamas or the Palestinian or the PLO before that. The issue are the Palestinian political demands. If those can be killed, as in if Palestinians accept that they will never have a state, then the Israeli authorities are happy. As long as Palestinians are organizing for resistance, they are deemed terrorists and elicit this kind of response.
So your answer reminds me of a piece that just came out today in Foreign Affairs by my colleague and friend Sarah Parkinson, comparing the invasion in Gaza with the Israeli invasion of southern Lebanon and the short-term and long-term results, including Sabra and Shatila, and a prolonged and likewise failed occupation and the indicator that you're using. So with that, I want to open up the floor to questions from our audience.
Turn on the video and turn it around so they can come up and show their faces. Good luck. Let's get to see. Over there.
Hi, Tareq. My name is Ibai.
Okay.
My question is about the goals of Hamas, short, medium, long term. I think obviously we've heard in their language liberation, of all of Palestine. Is the short-term goal freedom of the prisoners? Is it the Saudi deal? Like, what is the short, medium, long term, and could they ever? Do you ever see a scenario where they could live alongside, within, whatever, the state of Israel?
Yeah. So the short term goals, and by short term here I mean in the matter of days, when we're thinking about the negotiations and the ceasefire, the short term and immediate goal is to reach some kind of ceasefire and possibly an exchange of the captives, so that the hostages that Hamas is holding will be released in exchange for the civilians held in Israeli jails. And so I think that is its immediate goal. Now, the goal as I read it, and again, I haven't done any analysis or investigative journalism on this issue, because it's a state of war, but to understand what Hamas's objective was before October 7th or as a result of the operation, my analysis or my knowledge of the movement suggests that the only goal it had on October 7th was to disrupt the status quo and to really deliver the message that there can be no impunity for Israel, that as the state is increasing its attacks against the West Bank, Palestinians, more disruptions to the status quo, and that it's sort of the scale of its colonial violence is expanding while it's being rewarded with diplomatic successes either in the US or in normalization agreements with Saudi Arabia, that Hamas was disrupting that paradigm. that there can be continuity and success for Israel while the Palestinian question is unresolved. Now, the medium and longer term goal are a bit harder to understand at this moment because things are in flux. But historically, Hamas's medium-term goal was very clear. It was the establishment of a Palestinian state on 1967 without recognizing the state of Israel. That it had implicitly accepted the idea of the two-state solution without offering formal recognition. And this, it believed, was its right or the right of the Palestinian people to call for the dismantlement of the settlements and the removal of the settlers. And Hamas had offered a political manifesto or project to enter into a long-term truce with Israel to safeguard civilians on both sides in return for Palestinians establishing a Palestinian state. And regardless of what we might think of that offer, it was a major concession on Hamas's part, and it was one that was absolutely not entertained. So it was sort of set aside and not engaged with diplomatically. But I believe that continues to be Hamas's at least medium-term aspiration, or it had been until what's happening now, or until the recent past, with the increasing shift that we see in the Israeli political system and the more expressive calls for expulsion. It's unclear how Hamas might be able to push forward or engage with such a medium-term project. In terms of your question around the longer term and can it ever live with the state of Israel, again, these were its starting points for negotiations for how that might happen in the past. It's much more difficult to see that now. The longer-term goal that the movement had held on to, which is not a goal that is necessarily shared by all Palestinians, but this is Hamas's political project, was to create a state so to liberate the entirety of historic Palestine and to create a state that's grounded in Islam, where Jews, Muslims, and Christians can live equally side by side. So that was the movement's longer-term vision. Again, I don't see how that might change given the current rupture.
One of them around the back.
Sure. Oh, that's too late. I'm gonna knock down some things and say, oh, no. Hello. I'm Claire Buden. I'm a master's student in international affairs here. My question is related to the human shields question that's been talked about a lot over the past month. We see a lot of from the state of Israel, the IDF, sort of justifying attacks on civilian targets, with the reasoning that, oh, there are tunnels underneath this hospital, or that, civilians are being used as human shields by Hamas and that they're occupied there, and that's the reason why. I'm just wondering what is the history of that tactic by Hamas, and currently, do we see that tactic? How much of these reports have been definitively proven versus just kind of used as an excuse?
That's a great question. I mean, I'll focus on the more recent present and then go back to that past, because I agree with you that it's important to look at the track record and the history of that. So just in terms of the immediate moment, we still don't have any verified information about what's happening. And, I was just reading a piece in the New York Times before I came on the call about now the Americans accepting the Israeli narrative that there are tunnels that are used underneath or in the basements of these hospitals, while the New York Times is saying, there's no way to verify the footage that's coming from the Israeli sources. Now, it's important to say that a lot of the footage that has emerged by Israeli sources since 2007 have been disputed, and credible international media organizations have shown that footage to be false. And the two major ones was the first by a journalist called Bell True, who claimed that babies had been decapitated on October 7th. That was an assertion that was then used by the Biden administration to justify it giving a green light, and it turned out out to be false information. And that kind of misinformation is grounded in Islamophobia and Orientalist versions of, the quote unquote Arab barbarians and what they do. And the second source of misinformation was specifically around, God, I just had that point in my head. I'll come back to it. I can't recall now. Oh yeah, after the Al-Ahli hospital was bombed 2 weeks ago, and there was, obviously we still don't have the full insight into what happened, but Israeli governmental sources released what they claim to be a voice recording between two people, noting that the hospital was bombed by Palestinian fire, and that was quickly discredited because the accents that the actors had used were obviously not accents that any Palestinian has. And so that kind of misinformation that both sides are peddling in now, but specifically that's being pushed by the Israeli sources, is very, very deep, and we need to take everything with a grain of salt. Now, this is why it's important to go back. One last point to say on this. Even if all of this is true, and these hospitals and schools are used as weapons depots, under international law, it's still a war crime to attack them. The civilians and the patients in these hospitals are not legitimate targets. So even if that assertion was 100% verified, which it is not, and which is likely untrue, it is still a war crime to attack these places. It's still a war crime to stop the entry of fuel, medicine, water to 2 million Palestinians in Gaza. Now, to go back to the history, because that offers important insight. Israeli sources have historically used this accusation of human shielding, and there have been 3 major international investigations carried out, 1 by the International Criminal Court and 2 by the UN, after past military assaults. And as far as I know, and I'm not a legal expert, but as far as I know, there hasn't been any substantive proof that this is a policy that Hamas follows. There has been, I think, 1 or 2 incidents in which weapons were discovered in old deserted schools that were used by UNRWA that Hamas had turned into weapons depots. But the assertion that Hamas actively uses human shielding has been disproven by international investigations. Israel does not participate in these investigations, and so it's very difficult to get the Israeli evidence explored or investigated, because Israel does not approve of either the UN or the ICC as credible sources of information, which already should raise a significant red flag. But what has emerged from these investigations is that there are instances of Israeli soldiers using Palestinian civilians as human shields as they go into their air raid, into their night raids in the West Bank. So all of this to say is that there's a lot of legal work that's been done on this, and it's really important to not fall for narrative warfare.
That was kind of my...
Okay, curious about that human shield. Okay, we have some questions online. Okay, the first one.
If you look.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Tareq, there's been a lot of discussion lately, very heated discussion of the phrase "from the river to the sea" in Nahr al-Bahr. And earlier this afternoon, U.S. House Speaker Chuck Schumer said that the phrase is a genocidal chant that is an explicit call for the extermination of Israel. What are your thoughts? I'm going to broaden the question a little bit. What are your thoughts on the phrase itself and on the tactics of using it?
So, I mean, it's really important to also ask the question of why this is considered to be a genocidal phrase when Palestinians use it, but not when Israelis use it. This is a phrase that's used at the highest echelons of the Israeli political establishment, including with Benjamin Netanyahu appearing at the UN, showing a map of the greater land of Israel from the river to the sea. And that's applauded by American policymakers rather than criticized. And so I think the question here should really be, why is it that when Palestinians are seeking liberation from the river to the sea, it's genocidal? And when Israelis do that, it's acceptable and just taken as a matter of policy. So that's sort of the first thing I would say. Now, the second thing is that It really depends on who's using it. So for, I'd say the majority of the Palestinians who are committed to the vision of a decolonial future in Palestine, the river to the sea is really a vision of liberation. It's grounded in three values: freedom, justice, and equality. Freedom, meaning the end of occupation, so the end of military rule against Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Equality, meaning the end of the legal discrimination against Palestinian citizens of Israel. And justice really meaning the return of Palestinian refugees. Again, these three rights are rights that are inalienable rights under international law. So these are not demands that Palestinians are pulling out of thin air. They are demands that are grounded in numerous Security Council resolutions at the UN. So when Palestinians are referring to liberation grounded in these three values, they're really calling for an end to Israeli apartheid and to a space where all the inhabitants in the land between Palestine and Israel can live as equal citizens. When Hamas uses the river to the sea, it's using a similar vision, except couching it in Islamic terms. So they envision that state to be an Islamic state, but they have made explicit that such a state would also be a state where Jews, Christians, and Muslims are able to live within the borders of that state in equality. The idea that the dismantling of apartheid is genocidal is really problematic. It suggests that the only way Jews can exist in that state is as a dominant group, that there cannot exist in that state in equality with Palestinians. And that's something that it should be really investigated.
I actually have a question considering the idea of Hamas's vision for a free state. Considering that the language in the Hamas charter talks about killing Jews throughout Israel, what is your thoughts? So, what are your thoughts on like peaceful coexistence in that like scenario?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. Hamas's charter, which was released in 1988, was full of anti-Semitic tropes. So the movement at the time, so this is months into its establishment, relied on the book, the Elders of Zion, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is an anti-Semitic book that peddled in anti-Semitic tropes, and that became the basis for how the movement engaged with the Jewish question. And that was something that obviously and rightly got a lot of pushback from Palestinians and from members of the international community. Over the course of its 30-year history, the movement has become more sophisticated in how it engages with these questions, and has now in 2017 released an updated charter that upholds the separation, or the distinction, I should say, between Jews and Zionists. And it explains that as a movement, it is committed to fighting Zionism, which it sees as a settler colonial project in the land of Palestine, and actually has no issue with or problematic position towards Judaism as a religion. So this is sort of the most updated iteration of the charter. Now, if you tell me, is Hamas an anti-Semitic organization, which is a question that I get all the time, the answer is simple. If it was any other group other than a group that defines itself as a Jewish state that was colonizing Palestinians, Hamas would be fighting them just the same. So the issue is the fact that they're being colonized, not that they're being colonized by Jews. And I think this is fundamental for understanding how we engage with Hamas.
Okay, we have two questions about terrorism, so I'm going to sort of pool them together. One, how does it matter how we label Hamas? Is it a terrorist organization? Has the label changed? And what is the utility of that particular framework? And then related, so I'm sort of pooling a couple questions here. How useful or unhelpful is that language for assessing, non-state violence against presumably legitimate state violence? I hope I'm capturing those, that hybrid.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very important question. So, I mean, I think in the use of this language, I always go back to basics. If we're thinking of terrorism as terrorizing civilians in pursuit of a political project, then by Hamas's own admission, it terrorizes Israeli civilians in order to further its political project. Hamas talks about this openly. The issue in the use of this language is that it's manipulated and used in a very particular way. So obviously, when Palestinians attack Israeli Jewish civilians, they're seen as terrorist organizations. But Israel carries out attacks against civilians, against Palestinian civilians daily. And that violence is seen as legitimate, understandable, or placed within as a prism of, a security doctrine that Israel has, even though it's also illegal and a war crime and a violation of international law. And so the duplicitous ways in which that accusation of terrorism is placed is what is problematic in this instance. And it's often used to deflect from the political demands and the social infrastructure that Hamas has. If we see Hamas only as a terrorist organization, then actually the opening that Jeremy started us off with, which was the post 9/11 reality, becomes possible. That actually this is decontextualized, it's ahistoric, and this is just an irrational, bloodthirsty organization that is doing what it's doing because it hates civilians. And that kind of discourse then allows for irrational policy that is counterproductive and hugely destructive. So I think when we're talking about terrorism, I think we should be very clear what it is we're talking about. If we're talking about the ending of violence against civilians, then the biggest source of violence against civilians in the land of Palestine, Israel, is the apartheid regime. It's actually not Hamas. Now, Hamas must be held accountable for targeting civilians, of course, because that's a war crime under international law, but so should Israel. And the use of terrorism in the way that it's used, which is often couched in Islamophobia, and means that actually no accountability is given to the state of Israel, but instead it's given a green light to fight back against Palestinians. And so it becomes a form of actually entrenching violence in this space and preventing us from really breaking out of these structures.
So I want to ask the question that I meant to ask earlier and is popping up in the chat, related to breaking out of structures. Ian suggested that the current war didn't start on October 7th, but rather 1948. And he has written, quote, Hamas and Islamic Jihad didn't start a war, they launched a prison revolt. Is Gaza a prison? Is one question. And then more broadly, even before October 7th, I imagine very few of us in this room have been to Gaza, right? A lot of us have spent time in the Middle East, but probably not Gaza. Will you describe it for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really important question because the imagining, I think, of most people in the US, but not only in the US, more broadly than that, people believe that the blockade started because Hamas took over the Gaza Strip. They don't realize that the blockade started a decade before that in its current formation, and that actually Israel has experimented with ways to destroy the Gaza Strip since 1948, using targeted assassinations, using military assaults, using blockade, and using the development of collaborator networks. So the reason that Gaza is imprisoned, and yes, it is a prison, has nothing to do with Hamas. It's not actually a security question, it's a demographic question. The reason that the Gaza Strip is blockaded is because 2/3 of the more than 2 million Palestinians in Gaza are refugees claiming a right to return to their homes in what is now Israel. And the Israeli government, successive Israeli governments, have experimented with different ways to sever the Gaza Strip from the rest of historic Palestine. That allows Israel to maintain itself as a Jewish majority state, even while it continues to hold on to the West Bank. And so what that meant is that the way that the Israeli government deals with the Gaza Strip is to put it behind a blockade, think of it as a huge prison cell, and to suggest that, it's out of sight, out of mind, it's no longer our problem. That's essentially the way that the Israeli government had, until October 7th, dealt with the Gaza Strip. Now, what does it look like, or what does the Gaza Strip in practice look like on the inside? One of the questions, Jeremy, you asked me was, in my book, I talk about Gaza as a liberated territory. Is that a success? And in some ways, of course, it's not a success because Gaza is a prison cell. But it's also actually liberating being inside Gaza when you've been to the West Bank, because the West Bank is a place where every time you want to move or anyone wants to move, they have to encounter Israeli occupying forces. They have to encounter checkpoints. There are daily engagements with a regime that's violent and that's fundamentally bent on killing Palestinians. In the Gaza Strip, Palestinians inside Gaza, inside their prison cell, have relative freedom. They don't need to engage with the structures of the occupation to go to school or to go to hospital or to go grocery shopping. They can go to the sea. That doesn't happen in the West Bank, where the occupation manifests in a different way. So there's a certain degree of liberation in Gaza. And it's funny because before I went there and before I started spending time there, the image that I had of Gaza was one that I think many of you would have, which is that either it's this, horribly depressing place that's a humanitarian catastrophe, and that's totally destroyed under Israeli bombardment, or that it's a terrorist haven and it's run by Hamas and it's everyone who's there is wearing a Qassam bandana and actually obviously both of these are tropes. Gaza is a very vibrant place. There are great cafes and restaurants, and there are hotels and shisha bars, and it's as one would expect a bustling marketplace and a very diverse area that's full of life, and that gets lost in the media representation of Gaza. That's not to undermine the level of suffering in Gaza or the destruction or the hunger or the destitution. All of these things are there. But as anyone who's been to a refugee camp knows, those things and that suffering exists also with a lot of life and the goings on of normalcy. And that's very present in Gaza as well. For many Palestinians, it's a place of huge pride in the fact that actually the settlers there were removed, and that despite all of this brutalization that's happening against the Gaza Strip, it's still resisting, and that's something that Palestinians actually hold with a lot of pride.
Tareq, we have a question on Zoom from an anonymous guest asking, does Hamas make any distinction between Israelis who hold different political viewpoints, those who speak out against the policies of the Israeli state? Does Hamas deal differently with Israelis who, for example, have contested their state's settler colonial policies? Does Hamas recognize or ever envision working with them? Or are all Israelis blanket treated as agents of the Israeli state and thus permissible targets for the liberation movement?
That's a good question. I mean, I know that Hamas has engaged with material and with activists from progressive or anti-Zionist organizations, either Israeli or Jewish, and including to use material from, let's say, B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights organization. But I can't quite think of ways in which one might be able to see how they differentiate between Israelis based on their political views. I can't think of any declaration or any instance in which Hamas actively distinguishes, let's say, anti-Zionist Israelis from Israel. I think from the state project, but I do think that the way that Hamas has engaged in the question of civilians is really around the ethics and the strategic value of targeting civilians, and of the locations of civilians. So often in the past, it would differentiate between civilians who are located in occupied territories, so settlers as versus those living within the state itself. But I can't think of instances where Israel differentiates between it's obviously used anti-Zionist material, and that's an implicit support, but I can't think of ways in which it's distinguished beyond that.
This question made me think of the scene early in the war when a released hostage in her 80s shook hands with her Hamas captors and said shalom before walking away, and then gave a scandalous press conference about her treatment as a hostage.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have thoughts about that.
You want to come up with that? The question.
Yeah, I know.
A couple more student questions.
Hi, my name is Hannah Long. I'm an undergraduate student at Pardee. I had a question in regards to the recent boycotts of companies that have aligned themselves with either the State of Israel or IDF. I think the best examples have been Starbucks, McDonald's, and Domino's, which have pledged their support in the ways. I know a lot of comparisons have been made to companies during South African apartheid, like Polaroid and IBM, and there was overall successful boycotts of these companies. Do you believe that these boycotts will be successful in maybe not the direct actions of the State of Israel or IDF, but maybe in the United States' unequivocal support of their actions? Or do you believe that they might just be overall ineffective?
I think that's a great question. And I do think that they are effective. And I think they're a continuation of a lot of success that's been expanding slowly around the BDS movement. So the BDS movement, which follows the South African example and calls for boycott, divestment, and sanctioning of companies and institutions that are actively complicit in Israeli apartheid. It was started in 2005. And it's been gaining ground since. And many have said that it's ineffective in the sense that given the power disparity between Israel and the Palestinians, it's not possible to imagine that economic sanctions in this way can really shift the balance of power on the ground, especially when Israel is such a developed economy that's invested in all of these different sectors globally, and that seems to be facing no backlash. Yet, at the same time, BDS has been hugely transformative in terms of public opinion and in terms of creating spaces for grassroots mobilization and grassroots support to grow. And especially here in the US, I mean, I think I find myself in New York during this war. I don't normally live in the US. And the kind of shifts that I'm seeing on the street here are fascinating. I think there's a huge popular mobilization that is beginning to see through the fog of war and through the false narratives and to see what is actually happening. And I think in some ways, BDS and other movements, grassroots movements, university-based movements have really led in terms of that work. Much of it is generational. And so in that way, I do find the boycott of organizations like these very effective, even if not directly in the economic sense. That might be a future goal, but certainly in terms of expanding our knowledge and awareness of what's happening on the ground.
I'm going to ask a quick question online and then turn it to the final two questions will be in the room. Who besides Hamas or Islamic Jihad are articulating Islamic or Muslim visions of liberation within the broader Palestinian liberation project? Are the alternatives limited to secular or socialist or communist or nationalist? Are those on one side versus the Islamic options? Help us understand, and sort of now I'm paraphrasing, help us understand the broader world or universe of the Palestinian liberation movement.
So the Islamist parties are mostly Hamas and Islamic Jihad. I can't think of any political power or military power that's as organized or as developed that's putting forward an Islamic vision or an Islamist vision for Palestinian liberation. Now, it's important to distinguish a bit because Fatah, for example, is also a Muslim movement. It's not a secular movement in the sense that it still defines itself as a movement, or it still has a view of itself as a nationalist movement in a predominantly Muslim society. So it's in that way, it's not avowedly secular, but it's not Islamist in the way that it doesn't use Islam as its the foundation of its political makings. And so it's important to hold that distinction. And then there are obviously parties to the left of that. So the communist parties and the socialist parties, which at the moment, I do not think have any real grounding in Palestinian grassroots society. They're really shells of their former selves. So the PFLP, the Palestinian Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and the DFLP, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and then the Communist Party within Israel, were all much more active in the 60s and 70s than they are today. And that actually mirrors what's happening in the rest of the region, that, you know, the secular leftist parties of the past have either been completely discredited. So the Ba'ath parties in Syria or elsewhere in Iraq have either been completely discredited or decimated as parties. So there really isn't a left, I think, in Palestine that's functioning and that's active. And I think to my point about the biggest weakness of the Palestinians today, it's the absence of that kind of political diversity and liberation project that's able to hold that diversity.
Yeah. Hi, hello, I'm Gideon. I wanted to ask about PIJ, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, as you've mentioned it a few times, and I keep seeing it show up as like Hamas and also these guys. But I wanted to know just what its relationship is with Hamas, sort of politically. Does it take direction? Does it not take direction? How does it function within Gaza? Does it also have these sorts of networks? Overall.
Yeah. So Islamic Jihad emerged as a movement, also as an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, a few years before Hamas did. And it's a much smaller organization. And because it's splintered off rather than subsuming the infrastructure of the Muslim Brotherhood, it continues to be a much smaller offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood in the Gaza Strip. And unlike Hamas, Islamic Jihad never entertained engaging with the democratic process, so engaging in elections or emerging as a governing authority. And that's really the main difference between both parties. Hamas is the governing authority and is a much bigger military power. Islamic Jihad is aligned with most of Hamas's ideology, but has never entertained governance or engaging with the political process with elections. Islamic Jihad fundamentally believes that there can be no self-rule for Palestinians or governance as long as Israeli apartheid persists. As long as the occupation persists, Islamic Jihad is committed to a project of resistance. So that's a fundamental difference. But how it relates to Hamas is in every way the leader of what the resistance project looks like from the Gaza Strip today. So it sets the tone, and other parties in the Gaza Strip sort of operate with relative autonomy under the overall strategic direction of Hamas. There have been instances in the past decade where Islamic Jihad actually challenged Hamas's rule and broke from it. So Hamas would be looking to stabilize the Gaza Strip, and Islamic Jihad would fire a rocket or two to sort of challenge the blockade and try to compel Israel to ease restrictions into the Gaza Strip, and Hamas would there would be retribution. So Hamas would sort of crack down on Islamic Jihad. So it really is a situation where the two of them are very much allies, but Hamas sets the general tone.
Final question for Ike.
Hello, my name is Ike. I'm an undergraduate at Pardee. So I know you mentioned that the Palestine Liberation Project, essentially it's contained because there's a lot of different aspects and sectors within it. And essentially all the organizations that would have pushed for it are sort of have to now cooperate with the Israeli state. But I also think maybe this is beyond the purview of this conversation, but I think sort of the Israeli state or its project is also sort of weak. As you know, there was a lot of recent, like Israel has experienced a lot of recent elections because of this gridlock between its political parties. And also sort of outside of Israel, especially in the United States, has become sort of this more partisan issue as Netanyahu has sort of allied itself with Donald Trump. I think the attack on the October 7th attack sort of presents this opportunity for both sides in a sense of this rally behind the flag effect. This sort of Hamas now openly resisting Israel, and now Israel sort of now repressing Palestinians, and sort of you now see sort of in the West this like sort of divide between different communities. And so in a sense, what I'm asking, if Hamas sort of continues with its resistance project, do you think this is a method that could succeed in the future? And on the other end, if the Israeli state continues sort of with its punitive measures, with its oppressive measures, do you think its sort of, I guess, dominance, current sort of colonial dominance in the region, could it remain or even, grow into the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very good question. I completely agree with you. I think that the state actually it's a bit of a paradox, because on the one hand, the state is diplomatically very powerful and economically very powerful and militarily obviously very powerful, but it's also a state that's quite fragile. And I think that was clear on October 7th, not only militarily in terms of, Palestinians always think of the state as invincible, and obviously it's not, but also in terms of politically, there's a tension, a paradox at the heart of the state, which is that it thinks of itself as a democratic state, but also at the same time is obviously an oppressive state. And there's a tension there that I think is a fundamental weakness to the state structure, and one that will continue to be difficult to manage going forward. So in the future, I really don't think there's a return to what existed before October 7th. I think Israel now is in a position of real weakness. I think its biggest insecurities have been revealed. And I think Palestinians now are being challenged in ways that are possibly lethal. And so I think the future can hold either a very dark scenario of continuous civil war and discord, or a real situation in which we grapple with the core politics of the issue and allow for a different future to emerge. But a return to what happened before, I think, is something that I would really struggle to see.
Okay, I want to close with two very brief remarks. First, for those of you who haven't yet read Tareq's book, Hamas Contained: The Rise and Pacification of Palestinian Resistance, I strongly recommend it. Continue to learn from him, continue the discussion. The concluding chapter in particular is breathtaking. Theoretical scope is brilliant, and we will have Tareq visit. He has a permanent IOU for us because we couldn't actually bring him this fall. So hopefully he'll come in the spring or next year, somewhere down the line, in person, for an in-person conversation. And second of all, thank you, everyone. Thank you for listening. Thank you for learning. Thank you for debating. And thank you, Tareq, for teaching all of us. We will continue this conversation on November 27th with a conversation between Doug Waxman, who's a scholar of Israel Studies scholar, and our very own Margaret Lippman. So I look forward to seeing you all then, and I hope you'll join me in a round of applause for Tareq.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you for having me, and great questions, everyone.